Hello class, this is a tutorial on how to use image trace function to simplify a photograph of your face or somebody else's face if you wanted to use the portrait style painting and wanted to break it up to some simpler shapes. So the first thing we want to do um, is try to find a photograph on the internet and bring it into Illustrator. So you can copy your image and paste it in. If you have Safari, you can drag it into Illustrator, but we want to get that in there first. I recommend making your document an 8.5 by 11 so that once you do create your image trace portrait, that you can size everything the way you need to in the document and then send it to print right after. So this image here is already kind of cropped down closer to the face. So whenever you bring your image in, if it's a photo of yourself, just make sure that there's not really like a ton of background going on there. And it'll help Illustrator process the image a little bit easier whenever we're going into the image trace. Luckily, if you didn't crop your image beforehand, you can actually crop your image when you bring it into Illustrator. So whenever you bring it in, if you select it, you should see a crop image over on the quick actions. So let's go ahead and get started. So while my image is selected here, it will give me the option to image trace. So we'll go ahead and click on image trace. And we want to select 3 colors at first. So what this is going to do is it's going to try to recognize basically like 3 different values in the composition. And then from there, we can actually work up to 6 colors, 10 colors, wherever we feel happy, right? So let's go ahead and start off with 3 colors and see what Illustrator does for us. And again, if you're bringing in images from the internet, make sure that on the search tools that you are setting it to a large photo, right? So that you don't end up with a really teeny tiny photo whenever you bring it into your document. So here we're at 3 colors. So you can either play with a slider here, or you can type in the amount of colors that you want. So for me, 3 colors is good, but it definitely starts to get a little funny in here. Like you can't really tell where some of our edges are. So I'm gonna go ahead and then just kind of bump up to that 6 and see what 6 looks like, and then we'll hit enter. So you can see the difference between 6 and 3. There's a lot of shapes here in the background. Now we can actually distinguish the hat from the background. More and more details are starting to come forward. I actually already did this before whenever I was trying it, and I actually found out that I like the way that this image looks at 7 colors. So once we're at a point where we're happy with the amount of detail that we have in our image trace, the next thing we want to do is actually go over here in the quick actions and expand our image, right? So what that's going to do, it's going to create basically individual editable shapes for each one of these different color shapes here. So we'll go ahead and expand it, and you'll see the paths that it created for everything. So before I did any of this kind of image tracing, I did trace the silhouette of the head where I wanted it to basically cut later on. You don't need to do that while it's still a photo. You can do it at this point as well. So whenever you want to do it in the process is fine. So what I'm going to do is I already actually have my silhouette, so I'm going to make a copy of it. Then I'm going to take this silhouette, I'm going to bring it over the head just where I want to cut it. Then I'm going to hold shift and then click the photo that I image traced. So right now the silhouette's selected, and now I want to select the photo underneath it. Now that both are selected, we want to go ahead and make this clipping mask. So if you follow my mouse here on the right hand side, we'll click make clipping mask. So now the head is cut out and we don't have any of the background anymore. So perfect for a portrait. Alternatively, I could have also kind of come out here and built my silhouette out to the shoulder if I wanted to. But for my purposes, I kind of just want to play with the head, right? So we'll select those 2 again, make the clipping mask. The keyboard shortcut for the clipping mask is if you're on a Mac, it's Command and then 7. If you're on a PC, it'll be Control 7. So We'll do that now. Okay, so the colors that it actually generated um, for the image trace are based on the colors that were kind of predominant in the photo already. You can, after you expand it and before you do your clipping mask, you can come in here with your direct selection tool, select shapes, and recolor them one by one. So say you wanted a lot of different shapes in here or a lot of different colors in here. You could go that way and it'll take you a little while to recolor things. But if you're using multiple colors that are not in the same color family or they're not tints and shades of the same color the way we have here in this kind of monochromatic color scheme, this will be the way to do it. If you do kind of just want to play with another kind of monochromatic color scheme, the better way to do that would be to go ahead and come in here, do our clipping mask, and then this second silhouette that I built um, is basically going to function as the tool that I use to color this photo, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to select this silhouette, and since I use this silhouette to cut out the photo, we can actually line these up perfectly, right? So I'm going to hold shift while this is selected and then click onto my face here. And then on the right hand side, once we have two objects or more selected, in our properties panel over here on the side, we start to get these alignment tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a horizontal alignment on the center, and then I'm also going to do it on a vertical align center. So now we have a perfect kind of eclipse going on here, right? So with this color on top, you need to make sure your silhouette is on top. If it is down underneath it, it's not going to work. So we're going to hold Command, Shift, and then your forward bracket. And what this does is it'll actually bring our silhouette to the very top of our layers, right? So once this is on top, we're going to play with the different blending modes. If you guys have used Photoshop before, you're familiar with blending modes. In Illustrator, they're actually inside the opacity options. So we have this fill, and now when we go to our opacity, we'll click on this kind of drop down menu. And then what I usually do is I'll choose color, and that gives me basically the color that I had as my fill overlaid directly on top of the image underneath, and it gives me all of those tints and shades, right? So the only kind of downside here is that it does even colorize the white to kind of give it a little bit of that that color that was on top. So feel free to kind of play with these and then see what'll give you the best result. Some of these are kind of cool, a little funky. So play with these, and if you kind of come up with something that you like, uh, stick with it, right? Play with different fills, and just kind of see what all we can accomplish here, right? So weird color, like I said, is the one that I'm going to stick with for this one. So it could be that you maybe started off with a complementary color palette, and then maybe you wanted to play with maybe more of an analogous color palette whenever you're putting your composition together. This is kind of a mint green. So the color complement of this kind of mint green, yellow green would be more of like a red violet. So let's kind of pull that in here, right about there. So this would be an example of a complementary color scheme. I just built this rectangle, so I am going to need to bring my head to the very top layer. So again, that's Command Shift in the forward bracket. And then I'll bring that head over here. Now remember, 5x7 is just the minimum. So if you wanted to play with this image and say you wanted it to be a square format, like an 8x8, it doesn't have to stay in those same kind of dimensions, right? So as long as it's bigger than 5x7, um, we're in good shape, right? And we don't have to stop here. We'll go up to Object, and then we'll do the envelope distort, and then we can do a make with mesh or make with warp. Warp will give you some options to kind of choose from here in your warp options. There's a lot of different ones that we can pick from. Fisheye looks kind of funny. I like the way that looks. What's cool here is we can actually use our direct selection tool and start to kind of play with this. We could also use these sliders to kind of make some universal adjustments. Um, but using our direct selection tool and then kind of playing with this mesh here, uh, we'll give you a little bit more of a control over what's happening at each individual one of these points. So what I did with my other composition was I went to envelope distort, make with mesh, and I gave myself a 10 by 10 kind of mesh to play with. And then I went to my direct selection tool and just kind of click and drag. I selected this whole column here, and then just using my keyboard, I key over to the left, skip a row, and then I'll go over to this next row here. And I think I said left, I meant to say right the first time. But basically just alternating like waves here to make it look kind of melted. You can do crazier things than this. This is just kind of a quick kind of silly one to play with if you wanted to really kind of move that around and mess things up more. You can kind of play with that mesh a little bit more deliberately, and just kind of pull things. Try to make that photo a little bit more unique, a little bit more your own. You're also encouraged to bring in other images and like we've done before, make some kind of photo collage and play with those things individually. The more you can kind of give yourself to work with in the digital sense, the easier it's going to be when it comes to the analog, right? Because at that point, whenever it comes to our graphite transfer, we're really just kind of mapping things out. If we look closely here, these color shapes are broken down fairly visibly, right? So we can stick to as much detail as we want to here, or we can kind of go ahead and make some of these more kind of broad decisions, right? So in here, in the nose especially, like we have these, I think it's something like 4 layers in here from this really dark shadow, and then that's 1, 2, 3, 4 transitions here. For me, I would say that like this nostril here and then this dark shadow gives me enough of the nose to where maybe I don't necessarily need bridge, but I won't need like these 2 outer layers to create that eye or so on and so forth, right? So you can eliminate things from the shapes, like in the mouth. This mouth shape is sufficient for me. This little dimple in the chin. I don't necessarily need all these extra colors in here. Sometimes though, whenever we're making our color selection, whenever we're telling Illustrator how many colors we want in the composition, it will give us more detail if we kind of crank that number up a little bit higher, and then we can pick and choose which ones we want to use and which ones we want to leave out, right? So the next video would be, if you were interested in this process, the graphite transfer video. So you guys can see exactly how this looks transferred onto your piece of Bristol board, and then how I start to kind of map things out. Annotations are always helpful, especially when we have this number of colors to work with. I think it's smart to kind of use like an H for a highlight, and then you can use numbers for basically the different values, right? To annotate maybe light to dark. So if it was here, I could put an H here for my highlight, and then I could say this is my first value. So I'd put number 1 and number 2 and number 3 and number 4 to annotate what my darkest value is. And that could be a system that I use and say, treat this more like a color by numbers. So I know where all my 1s are, all my 2s are, my 3s and my 4s, so that I can kind of, as I mix a color, um, build my image out. One thing that I do recommend, and I didn't mention this, I think on the graphite transfer video, is whenever you do start to paint your image, I think it's smart to start with your darkest values first, just so that we kind of start to establish that boundary. So start with your darkest values, and then after you've done your absolute darkest value, then follow that up with your lightest value, right? So we kind of have a good range to work with. We know where our extremes are, and everything is kind of clearly outlined. We're going to be able to track that edge and bring it back later on whenever we need to clean things up. So starting with your dark will help you not only uh, stay on top of those distinctive areas, but also kind of give your painting a little bit more structure. You can combine this digital kind of near photorealistic with some hand drawing, with crayons or anything that's kind of like in the opposite direction, super loose to kind of create some contrast. Do whatever you want with this, and then just be as creative as possible. It is only, I think, 3 compositions that I'm asking you guys to work on. So the longer you can kind of sit with one and kind of really develop it, I think the better. Unless you, like I said in the previous video, if you're really not feeling it and you want to go a different direction, this could be a way to find that out pretty quickly, right? So give this a try, and try not to spend too much time in the digital, because these do ultimately need to be hand painted projects at the end of the day.